Welcome to the Voice of Retail. I'm your host, Michael LeBlanc. This podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Retail Council of Canada. The way we decide matters. So says Eric Johnson, director of the Centre for Decision Sciences at Columbia Business School and author of the new book, The Elements of Choice. In a great conversation, we delve into the architecture of choice. According to Eric, every time we make a choice, our minds go through an elaborate process most of us never notice. We talk about how all of this applies to our lives and our lives as retailers in this exclusive interview. Speaking of great choices, I heard from the team over at Global E-Commerce Leaders Forum that the e-commerce industry was back out in force last week at Palm Springs at Retail West. If you're looking to ramp up your e-commerce sales outside of Canada and the US, definitely put Guelph LA 22 on your schedule for next month. Global DTC and cross-border e-commerce community will be back in West Hollywood on April 21st at the Directors Guild of America. You can sign up at globalecommerceleadersforum.com. And if you have a great international story to share, the Guelph is always looking for new voices to join them on the stage. That's April 21st for Guelph LA 2022. Eric, welcome to the Voice of Retail podcast. How are you doing this afternoon?
Real well, Michael. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thanks so much for joining me. I'm really excited in the overall science, so to speak, of making choices. It's part of my life as a veteran retailer. Before we jump into your book, tell us about yourself. Tell us about your background and what you do for a living.
Sure. I teach at Columbia Business School at Columbia University, where I teach courses on things like consumer finance and consumer decision making. I also have had the pleasure of working in government. I was at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau here in the United States for a while. I've worked with companies in financial services, in automotive, and even an occasional retailer or two.
Now, how would you describe your educational background or your background? Do you describe yourself as an economist or a social scientist? How do you think of yourself, or how do you like to be?
I'm really trained as a cognitive psychologist, which is people who think about how the brain works, and I've always been fascinated by decisions. So that's been a really happy combination of things. And I was lucky enough to study with some. I was in, as they say in the musical Hamilton, I was in the room when it happened. So I've been around working with some of the better people in the field and hopefully making some contributions of my own.
You know, when I think of decision, I was reflecting on the pop culture around a movie like The Matrix, which is, what a lot of people think about decisions and the movie, the philosophy of the movie. But you've got and have chaired and been president of the Center for Decision Sciences at Columbia, different societies that are all about judgment and decision making. Talk about that. What is that, field? And I had no idea that there was these associations and societies dedicated to such an interesting field. Talk about that a bit.
Yeah, so what's interesting is that I think there's been a realization in the last 30 years that there's a big difference between how people should make decisions, the way economists think about how people should do decisions, the kinds of things we teach most of our undergraduates when they're taking microeconomics, and how people actually make decisions. That is, how they actually get around to deciding what mortgage to buy or what house to look at or what sweater to buy. And that has been a really very interesting set of developments, because it's not that they are randomly different. It's that they're systematically different. They do things that are different than they should, and they do it pretty consistently.
I can't have you on the mic at this particular time that we're in today, whether it's the COVID crisis or the war in the Ukraine. I've got a background in foreign policy and of all things nuclear deterrence, and we studied a lot about decision making, and within that models, game theories. And my conclusion often became that decision makers had to reach these conclusions with pretty imperfect information. And the cognitive biases sometimes overcame what we might call good decisions. Do you reflect on that and think about the intersection of that and your field?
Sure. There turns out there's a great field called behavioral game theory, which is, again, it's not how economists think people play games, but actually how people do play games. And I was just thinking about General Petraeus, when we went into Iraq, when we being the U.S. government, he said, "Remind me how this all ends." He thought about the end game. He thought from backwards thinking forwards, and people don't do that. They actually often just do courses of action without contemplating what's going to happen at the very end. So that sort of failure of what we call backward induction, being able not to see how things will turn out, is a big part of behavioral game theory. And I think thinking about what's happening today, I think a lot of folks are saying, oops, what happens if I'm wrong?
Yeah, I mean, it's also, I think about it as like the law of unintended consequences, right? I think I'm going to, spread apart allies, but really what I just done is put them back together. And do you contemplate that as when you make your decisions, that is it a failure to think about unintended consequences, or is that just a defect in our decision making or overall decision processes?
Well, it's a little bit more specific, maybe, in the sense that it's not just we're not seeing what might happen; it's that we just don't think about the end game. So let me give you a little example. It might be too much for radio, but let's give it a try. Imagine I was going to say to you, here's $5. I'm going to let you split that $5 with someone else. Imagine there's someone else in the studio with you. And what you should do is actually give them what you think they'll accept. Mm-hmm. And if you both agree, we're happy. You both take whatever you agreed to and you go home. If you're not, you both walk away with nothing. Yeah. Now, that turns out that's called the ultimatum game. Uh-huh. And what the ultimatum game does is basically see how much do you think you can get away with. In economics, it's pretty clear. It says you should offer the other person a penny, because if they have a penny, they're better off than they were before. And of course, you'll get $4.99. Now, it turns out, of course, that's not how people play the game. They, in fact, think a little bit better than that, and they go, oh my gosh, I have to offer at least $2 of the $5 to somebody. And if you do, even then you won't always agree. So it's that balance of economists think of what is the totally rational thing to do. And in behavioral game theory, we think about things like people have beliefs in fairness, and that turns out to be very important.
Indeed. Well, let's talk about your book, The Elements of Choice, Why the Way We Decide Matters. Now, that's available now. It was released last year. It's actually a post by Richard Thaler that brought it to my attention. And in fact, you start the book talking about choice architecture, which I believe was a term, if not a study, created by Richard Thaler. Talk about choice architecture and what and how that's the foundation and how we make decisions.
Thaler and Sunstein, Richard and Cass, in their book Nudge, coined the term for something that I think most people knew, but it needed a really good name, and they were quite generous in providing that. Mm-hmm. Essentially, whenever you make a choice, you have to realize someone else has been there before you. They've decided how many options to present to you, what those options are, what's first in the list, what's last in the list. I mean, you walk into a store, obviously there's a whole science of how you lay out things on shelves and things. Yeah. But we don't tend to think about that person making those decisions. That's someone we can call a choice architect, because they're actually designing the environment where we make a choice. And the interesting thing is we basically forget about them entirely and start thinking about what we want. Now, it turns out that choice architecture, those decisions that person has made, can really influence our choices in lots of ways.
Retailers are, I guess, and you talk about retailers in shelf design, but in fact, you call it as a rich application of choice architecture. As you said, I mean, everything from the flyers, the marketing, everything, high-low pricing strategies, gamification of retail. What have we learned in modern decision science that can help, whether it's eye tracking or whether it's the work you do one-to-one, that might surprise our listeners, that perhaps surprise you, and that the retailers listening can learn something from? They might just be doing it and not call it choice architecture. It's just kind of what they do for a living. But talk about that for a minute.
Part of what it is, it's true that in some sense I'm rediscovering some of what they know, but there's something else that I think is really important here, which is you need to have some idea of how this works. It's one thing to say things at eye level tend to be chosen, but It's really more interesting to be able to say, why is it that they tend to be chosen? And one of the reasons is it turns out that order makes a big difference in choice. In many, many situations, the first thing will have a boost. You could take the same 5 products, put one first in the list, it will get a boost and be chosen more often. And so and the reason for that is because people don't search as much as they should, at least according to economics. They basically stop too early in many cases. And that basically, for the person ends up being the decision maker, the chooser ends up being less good in terms of the outcomes they get, but it will have an influence in what is chosen. So the retailer will be very happy to know that fact.
I think you call this the primacy effect, right? The first.
That's correct. It's not my term, but yeah, it's a common term for that.
So in today's world, and it's oftentimes we say, today's world is faster, moving faster every day. That may or may not be true. That may be a cognitive bias. But in the world like that, and the paradoxical world where we've got more power to search than we've ever had in our lives, think of Google and the internet. Do you think it's getting, that primacy effect is getting more amplified, or do you see it moderating? Where do you see it going?
So here's where actually having some idea of why that happens helps. So I was talking about first being best, and that's true because people get to decide when to stop searching on their own. But that's not true of the entire world. I mean, often it's what you look at first. So being first on the list is one thing. Being eye-grabbing attention is another thing. So I talk a little bit in the book about Netflix, which does tons of studies to try and get their landing page optimized. And something that it seems pretty clear for them is they actually try and make sure something that's very eye-catching is right in the middle of the list. And because you look at that first, you'll choose it. So it's not being first in the list. It's being first to be attended to. And, to go back to your question, as the world gets more complex, as I go to Amazon and see 26 different kinds of shaving cream, order or of attention is going to be very important. It's going to be more and not less important. And let's take that one step further. Think about when you're shopping on Amazon on your phone. Right. It's even harder to scroll down. So order effects will be even stronger there.
Yeah. We would call it sometimes the default option. When you're offered a choice and you've made that choice and you just keep getting offered the same choice, you could opt out of the choice. Payment, for example, in subscription.
That's right. Although technically there's a little bit more to a default option, which is it's usually something that's pre-selected.
Right.
That I think they have a lot in common. But if the example of a method of shipping being pre-checked when you go to Amazon, or the default being that you're going to be your credit card will be charged in the future for this streaming service. The fact that it will happen if you do nothing is the special thing about what I call a default.
I want to double click on the retail example for a little bit. So there is a school of thought. It still is the case that broadly speaking, there are two directions to go in pricing. So in one pricing, it's let's call it high-low, right? Retailers would price a product and then discount it off, create some excitement is the idea by saying regular price is $1, only today 75 cents. Other retailers would take an everyday low price. In other words, we're going to give you value every day. You don't have to choose, so to speak, the day you show up. And there's a famous example where JCPenney decided to really make what became a bit of a jarring transition from everyday low price, discounts, coupons to we're just going to give you the best price. Do either of those have prominence in your work, or is it really just either or, and it's literally a choice between which way to go?
I think the lesson that JCPenney, to drill down on that a little bit, learned is that their customers had learned what prices should be, and they were trained to use a high-low pricing scheme. And it takes a long time to change that behavior, and long time turned out to be too long for Ron Johnson, who was CEO. It's clear that what happens is people get an expected price. They expect to pay for something. And for some part of the JCPenney market, that was basically the low end of the high-low price. And then an everyday low price was not a bad deal, but it wasn't what they were used to paying.
Do you think the idea of, and I've talked to retailers who think about this and professors, this gamification idea, so much in our life is gamified, choice is made fun, let's call it that way. Is that a part of high-low retail, that it makes it fun and interesting and exciting, even though intuitively listen, I could probably go somewhere else and it goes on deal 25 weeks of the year, so I could just wait. But yet you're still excited by the fact that you see a sale prices. What's going on there in our minds?
Well, I think most retailers think people think about their products more than they really do. and they think more about pricing than what they really do. I mean, there's certainly a segment that loves to play that game, but I think the reality is that they're going into the store and trying to get out relatively quickly. Yes, people will pay some attention to price, but they're not spending that much time thinking about what's on the shelf. They just want to buy the breakfast cereal and get out of there.
I want to talk about something, pull on a thread you talked about, the choice. And author Barry Schwartz talked about the tyranny of choice, which gets me back to the decision architecture and retailers some of whom I want to offer you a vast amount of choice. I want to be known as the person to come and get 100 different power drills, and others who take a very curated approach to choice. Are they both right? Is there a direction that you could provide?
There's a real trade-off there, right? Because when you go, if you know what you want and you're an expert and you're capable of evaluating all 100 drills, you're thrilled to have that. At the same time, even that person really wants that assortment to be organized. So here are the cordless drills. Here are the quarter-inch drills. Here are the lightweight drills. And so there's really no sense in which just throwing 100 random options is good. The problem is there's a trade-off. On one hand, you want to make it easy for people to find the drill they want. And so you make that a small number of drills. At the same time, people often have different needs. There's a contractor and there's the me trying to hang a lightweight poster on the wall. We have very different needs, and if you curate it to just one or two, you're actually making it much harder for the person because they're not going to find what they want in your assortment. So there are two very different countervailing forces: the need to provide people with a variety and assortment of things, and to keep it simple so that they don't spend all day searching for which drill to buy, to use your example.
Do you think we can get overwhelmed by too much choice? As I sometimes I do. I mean, you referred to it even as 20 different types of shaving cream or whatever you have that you get so overwhelmed that it basically breaks the decision architecture that
what happens is people give up, and they give up in two ways. They pick something that is not in their best interests, just something they wouldn't really want, or they tend to walk away. Yeah. So, there's a lot of work done that talks about the curse of choice, but there's a balance. You also want to make sure people get the right option. You can get there by carefully thinking about, actually, one way of doing it is thinking about, what does this customer want? So on the web, I can actually help people by giving them a smaller choice set that's specific to them based on what I know.
Or specific to your brand, right? In other words, I'm all about this, and trust me, I've made the choice for you, right? This is the one air fryer that you should buy, and thereby that's your choice. That's your only choice here. That's not an uncommon strategy, right?
No, that's right. But of course, the other thing is not everybody wants the same kind of air fryer.
I was doing an interview with an expert in AI, and we were talking about biases. And I asked her if at some point AI was so biased by the programming that it was just going to help us make bad decisions quicker. Have you and your colleagues starting to think about the impact of artificial intelligence on decision making and the training that goes into it and the role it plays in our lives?
This is it's an important but an old issue. People have talked about using things like regression models, and the regression model reflects the world as it is. And that may have, serious biases. So if I, try and figure out who's going to be a good employee using either a regression model or AI, I'm only going to discover the existing patterns. I'm not going to see what can be done.
I guess it's a there's that quote around Henry Ford. If I ask customers what they would have wanted, it's a bit of a faster horse. So I guess the limitation is the imagination of the person deciding. But is that overcome by this decision architecture?
Choice architecture can be really useful for giving people ideas that they might not have or they might not come to easily. Let me share one example I really like from the book, which is doctors tend to prescribe the brand name drugs. And it turns out those are more expensive. They're about 5 times more expensive than the generics. And that matters because if you have cheaper drugs, people are more likely to keep taking the drugs. That is, they're not actually going to try and skip every other day so they can afford the medicine. Now, it turns out a friend of mine who has worked in one of the hospitals here in New York changed the system so that instead of having to type in the name of the drug, you basically, if you typed in the name of the brand name drug, actually the name of the generic popped up, reminding people of what the generic name was. Now, it's interesting because you think doctors would know the names of drugs, but, let's take a classic antihistamine called Allegra. That's easy to remember. They got pens with the name Allegra on it.
Right.
But it turns out the other drug, which is called, ready for this, fexofenadine hydrochloride, is not so easy to remember.
Doesn't roll off the tongue.
Because what is easy to remember, that's what they prescribe.
Yeah.
And so choice architecture can actually improve their decisions and improve people's medical care.
Interesting. Now, there's another example you talk about in the book, and it's in life insurance, which is a lot about making decisions. And I think it goes something like people are offered or asked how long they think they're going to live or when they think they're going to die. Is that framing important? Does that really make such a difference?
Yeah, so much of our life comes from what we retrieve from memory. In that case, when I ask you what year you'll live to, you start thinking about all the things you've been doing that's good for yourself, and lots of things like your Aunt Betty, who lived till she was 102.
Yeah.
In the die-by frame, you start thinking about Uncle Mortimer, who died of a heart attack at 69. The fact she smoked cigarettes for a couple of weeks in college, and people's estimates are almost 10 years different when you use those two frames.
Wow. And it's so interesting. You conclude your book on thoughts about, us become better choice architects or, understanding what the choices that are put in front of us. So 2 starts, 1 stop advice for listeners based on everything you've learned and teach on the elements of choice. So 2 things retailers, folks listening should start doing, and 1 thing maybe they should reconsider doing.
It's almost too easy of a pitch. You should stop thinking about the display from your perspective and start thinking about it from the customer's perspective. The customer is looking at this choice as a problem to solve. And you should start thinking about how you can help them make that decision more easily. And the big stop is stop ignoring choice architecture and start paying attention to it. And it turns out people don't pay enough attention to choice architecture. There's a lot of examples in the book where well-meaning firms are making mistakes by presenting options to people in ways that they don't like and the customer doesn't like.
Well, my guest is Eric Johnson. The book is The Elements of Choice, Why the Way We Decide Matters, available in all the places, no doubt, that you can find and where you love to shop for books. Where can folks, go pick up the book? That seems to like a great choice to me. Where can listeners go to keep in touch? And are you on social media, LinkedIn, or do you write often in other journals? Where can they go and keep touch on what you're thinking?
So the website for the book, if you just want to see what's going on there, is called theelementsofchoice.com, or elementsofchoice.com also works. And on Twitter, I'm fairly active as the Professor Johnson, and so you could follow me there. And of course, you all know bookstores you can use and support your favorite bookstore.
Yeah, right on. All right, well, I'll put those links in the show notes. Listen, what a great decision to get on the mic with you. It's so interesting. I love reading the book. I recommend it to everybody, and I'm sure it's just the beginning of our understanding of a deeper element of choice. So thanks again for joining me on The Voice of Retail. It's a real treat to listen to you, and I wish you much continued success.
Well, thank you so much, and it's been a lot of fun, and goodbye to all your listeners.
Thanks for tuning into this special episode of The Voice of Retail. If you haven't already, be sure and click and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform so new episodes will land automatically twice a week. And check out my other retail industry media properties, the Remarkable Retail Podcast, Conversations with Commerce Next podcast, and the Food Professor podcast with Dr. Sylvain Charlebois. Last but not least, if you're into barbecue, check out my all-new YouTube barbecue show, Last Request Barbecue, with new episodes each and every week. I'm your host, Michael LeBlanc, president of M.E. LeBlanc Company and Maven Media. And if you're looking for more content or want to chat, follow me on LinkedIn or visit my website at meleblanc.co. Have a safe week, everyone.